October 21st, 1969. A telegram arrived at Apple Records in London. 3 Savile Row. Addressed to Paul McCartney. 3 signatures at the bottom: Jimi Hendrix, Miles Davis, Tony Williams. The message was simple, urgent. We are recording an LP together this weekend in New York. How about coming in to play bass? Stop. Call Alan Douglas 212-581-2212. Peace. 3 of the greatest musicians in the world, inviting a 4th, to create what would have been the most insane supergroup in history. Paul McCartney never got the message. He was on vacation in Scotland. His assistant Peter Brown replied the next day. McCartney was away. Wouldn't be back for 2 weeks. The session never happened. 11 months later, Jimi Hendrix was dead, aged 27. The album that could have changed music history, jazz fusion meeting psychedelic rock meeting pop genius, was never made. This is the story of Jimi Hendrix and Miles Davis. 2 visionaries. 2 revolutionaries. 1 unrealized dream. Miles Davis and Jimi Hendrix. At first, it sounds impossible. Jazz and rock. Trumpet and guitar. Juilliard-trained virtuoso and self-taught genius. But by 1968, they were moving toward the same place. Miles was leaving traditional jazz behind, getting darker, funkier, more electric, listening to James Brown, Sly and the Family Stone, and especially Jimi Hendrix. Jimi was leaving traditional rock behind, getting more experimental, longer jams, more improvisation, more jazz influence. They were heading toward each other, and they both knew it. Miles Davis was born May 26, 1926, in Alton, Illinois. Middle-class black family. His father was a dentist, successful, educated, ambitious for his son. Miles got a trumpet at 13. By 18, he was in New York playing with Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, the greatest bebop musicians in the world. He studied at Juilliard, learned music theory, composition, arrangement, everything formal, everything structured, everything by the book. But Miles wasn't interested in following rules. He wanted to make new ones. In the 1950s, he pioneered cool jazz with Birth of the Cool. Softer, more relaxed, less aggressive than bebop. A new way of thinking about jazz. In 1959, he released Kind of Blue, the best-selling jazz album of all time. Modal jazz, not built on chord changes but on modes, scales, moods, giving musicians more freedom to explore. By the mid-1960s, Miles had his second great quintet. Wayne Shorter on saxophone, Herbie Hancock on piano, Ron Carter on bass, Tony Williams on drums. They were redefining what jazz could be. More abstract, more free, more adventurous. But Miles was restless, always restless. He started listening to what was happening outside jazz. James Brown, Sly and the Family Stone, the funk revolution, the beat, the groove, the electricity, and he heard Jimi Hendrix. By 1968, Miles wrote in his autobiography, "I was listening primarily to James Brown, Sly and the Family Stone, and particularly Hendrix. Miles saw something in Jimi that other jazz musicians dismissed as noise. He saw structure in the chaos. He saw a guitarist thinking like a horn player, long melodic lines, dynamic phrasing, emotional expression beyond technique. Most jazz musicians in 1968 hated rock music. Too simple, too loud, too commercial. But Miles didn't see it that way. He saw rock energy as something jazz needed, something to pull it out of the academic, cerebral direction it was heading. He was a natural musician, Miles said about Jimi. Couldn't read music, but he could pick up complicated pieces in the blink of an eye. Self-taught genius. Coming from Miles Davis, Juilliard-trained, theory-obsessed Miles Davis. That was the ultimate compliment. Miles started planning his next revolution. Electric instruments, rock rhythms, funk grooves, multiple keyboards, multiple drummers, dense layers of sound. In August 1969, Miles recorded Bitches Brew. Released in 1970, it would become the defining jazz fusion album. Dark, hypnotic, electric, using rock energy and studio techniques to create something completely new. But Miles wanted a guitarist who could bridge both worlds. Jazz sophistication with rock power. He wanted Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix was born November 27, 1942, in Seattle. Poor black family. Troubled childhood. His mother struggled with alcohol. His father was strict, often absent. Jimi got his first real guitar at 15. No formal training. No music theory. No lessons. Just his ears. His imagination. His obsession. He learned by listening to records. Blues records. R&B records. Chuck Berry. Muddy Waters. B.B. King. He'd play along until he got it right. By the mid-1960s, Jimi was a backup guitarist, working for other people's dreams. Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, Wilson Pickett, Ike and Tina Turner, playing their songs, wearing matching suits, staying in the background. Little Richard famously fired him for being too flashy. "You're trying to steal my show," Richard said. Then 1966 happened. London. Chas Chandler discovered him. Formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience with Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell. Within months, Jimi exploded. Hey Joe. Purple Haze. The Wind Cries Mary. 3 albums in 2 years. Are You Experienced? Axis. Bold as Love. Electric Ladyland. Each one pushing further than the last. By 1969, Jimi was the biggest rock guitarist in the world. Played Woodstock, Monterey, Isle of Wight, sold out tours, magazine covers, guitar god status. But Jimi was feeling trapped. The Jimi Hendrix Experience had broken up. The 3-piece power trio format felt limiting. 3-minute songs felt confining. The expectation to play Foxy Lady and Purple Haze every night felt like a cage. Jimi wanted to stretch out, improvise, create in the moment, stop repeating himself. He'd always loved jazz. Growing up, his father played jazz records constantly. Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Louis Armstrong. It was in Jimi's DNA. Now Jimi was actively studying jazz musicians. Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Wes Montgomery, listening to how they improvised, how they built solos not on riffs but on melodic development, how they created tension and release through dynamics rather than volume. In early 1970, Jimi formed Band of Gypsys with Buddy Miles on drums and Billy Cox on bass. More funk-oriented, more improvisation-focused, longer jams. Their New Year's Eve 1969 and New Year's Day 1970 shows at the Fillmore East captured this new direction. Machine Gun, a 12-minute tour de force of controlled improvisation, dynamic shifts, and emotional intensity. More jazz influence than anything Jimi had recorded before. This was the direction Jimi wanted to go, away from 3-minute radio singles, toward extended musical explorations. And that's where Miles Davis came in. Miles understood extended improvisation. Miles understood creating in the moment. Miles understood jazz structure without being bound by it. Jimi saw Miles as the bridge to the next phase of his evolution. The story goes that Miles first heard Jimi through a girlfriend in the mid-1960s. She was into the new rock scene. Played him Purple Haze. Miles was skeptical. Rock guitar? Too simple. Too loud. But then he listened. Really listened. And he heard it. The blues foundation. The harmonic sophistication hiding behind the distortion. The way Jimi bent notes, not just for effect, but to create new emotional colors. The way he used feedback as a compositional tool, not just noise. Damn, Miles said. Damn. Another story has John McLaughlin, the British jazz fusion guitarist who would later play on Brew, taking Miles to see Jimi perform live in New York. Miles stood near the stage, arms crossed, watching intently. Every time Jimi took a solo, Miles would shake his head and mutter, "Damn, damn," not disapproval, amazement. By 1968, Miles and Jimi were both living in New York. Miles on the Upper West Side, Jimi renting apartments in Greenwich Village and on 12th Street, depending on which girlfriend he was with. According to Miles's 1989 autobiography, they started jamming together at Miles's apartment. Informal sessions. No pressure. No recordings. Just 2 musicians exploring sounds together. Miles would play trumpet. Jimi would play guitar, often unplugged or through a small practice amp. They'd trade ideas. Push each other. What did these sessions sound like? Nobody knows. No recordings exist. No other musicians were present to document what happened. But we can imagine Miles's modal trumpet lines floating over Jimi's chord voicings. Jimi responding to Miles's melodic phrases with complementary guitar lines. Both improvising in the moment, creating conversations without words. Miles was fascinated by Jimi's musical instinct. The way Jimi could hear something once and play it back immediately. The way he created complex harmonic structures without knowing the theoretical names for them. One story, possibly apocryphal but repeated in multiple sources, has Miles trying to explain music theory to Jimi during one of these sessions. Miles was talking about the diminished scale, how it works, when to use it, the theory behind it. Jimi listened for a minute, then stopped him. Miles, I don't know what a diminished scale is. Miles smiled. Don't worry, I'll show you. And he did. Not through theory, through sound. Miles played it on trumpet. Jimi played it back on guitar. Immediately. Perfectly. It didn't matter that Jimi couldn't read music. It didn't matter that he didn't know the terminology. Miles understood that Jimi's ears were his theory. His fingers were his education. His instinct was his training. He was a genius, Miles said. Self-taught genius. Maybe the greatest natural musician I ever played with. Coming from Miles Davis, who'd played with Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, Bill Evans, Herbie Hancock, that meant something. Miles didn't give compliments lightly. These apartment jams convinced Miles a full collaboration had to happen. They needed to get in a studio, with a rhythm section, with time to really explore. But there was always something preventing it. Busy schedules, financial negotiations, the logistics of making it happen. Until October 1969, when they finally set a date. By 1969, both Miles and Jimi were thinking about a collaboration. Something official. In a studio. On record. Miles was working on what would become Brew, his revolutionary jazz fusion album. Electric. Funky. Dense. Multiple guitars. Rock energy with jazz improvisation. Jimi was thinking beyond the power trio format of the experience. He wanted horns. He wanted jazz players. He wanted to stretch. They started talking seriously. Contacted producer Alan Douglas. Started making plans. But there was a problem. Money. Miles Davis was Miles Davis. He didn't work for free. Multiple sources claim Miles wanted $50,000 upfront to record with Jimi. In 1969, that was serious money. Record companies were skeptical. Jazz and rock. Could it work commercially? So the sessions kept getting delayed. Busy schedules. Financial negotiations. The usual industry complications. But the plan was still alive. Miles and Jimi were going to make it happen. And then Miles had an idea. They needed a bass player. Someone melodic. Someone from a different tradition. Someone who could bridge worlds. Let's get Paul McCartney, Miles said. October 21st, 1969. Tuesday evening in New York. Miles Davis, Jimi Hendrix, and Tony Williams sat down to plan a recording session. Tony Williams was Miles's former drummer, one of the greatest jazz drummers alive. He'd played on Kind of Blue at age 17. 17. A prodigy. Now 23, he was a master of complex polyrhythms, explosive power, and delicate finesse. Tony had left Miles's quintet in 1969 to form his own band, Lifetime, one of the first true jazz fusion groups, featuring guitarist John McLaughlin and organist Larry Young. Tony understood both worlds, the jazz tradition and the rock future. The three of them were planning to record that weekend. October 25th to 26th, 1969. Last minute. Spontaneous. No pre-written material. Just get in the studio and create. The way Miles liked to work. Producer Alan Douglas was on board. Douglas had worked with Eric Dolphy, Duke Ellington, and would later become controversial for his posthumous Jimi Hendrix releases. But in 1969, he was the right person to shepherd a project this ambitious. But they needed a bass player. Someone special. Someone who could bring something different. Let's get Paul McCartney, someone suggested. Probably Miles. He admired McCartney's melodic bass lines. The way Paul's bass playing on Beatles records wasn't just holding down the bottom. It was creating melodies, counter-melodies, conversations with the guitars and vocals. So they typed out the telegram. Paul McCartney. Apple Records. 3 Savile Row, London/England. We are recording an LP together this weekend in New York. Stop. How about coming in to play bass? Stop. Call Alan Douglas 212-581-2212. Two-piece Jimi Hendrix, Miles Davis, Tony Williams. Impromptu. Urgent. Casual. Fly to New York this weekend and make history with us. The telegram was sent via Western Union. International transmission. London office would deliver it to Apple Records the next morning. Now they waited for Paul's response. But Paul McCartney never saw it. October 21st, 1969, was one of the worst days of Paul's life. That same day, the exact same day the telegram was sent, DJ Rovi Young from New York's WABC radio station went on air and gave massive exposure to the Paul is dead conspiracy theory. The rumor had been building for weeks. Clues supposedly hidden in Beatles songs. Album covers supposedly showing Paul's death and replacement. The whole insane story. But Roe v. Young's broadcast made it international news. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Reporters calling Apple Records. Fans gathering outside Paul's house. Chaos. Paul was also dealing with the Beatles falling apart. John Lennon had already told the other Beatles he was leaving the band, though they'd agreed to keep it secret for business reasons. Lawsuits were looming. Friendships were fracturing. Paul needed to escape. On October 22nd, the day after the telegram was sent, Paul took Linda and their daughters to his farm in Campbellton, Scotland. Remote. Quiet. Away from London. Away from everything. When the telegram arrived at Apple Records, Paul's assistant Peter Brown opened it. Read it. Made a decision. Paul was on vacation. Stressed. Dealing with enough. This crazy telegram asking him to fly to New York this weekend to record with Miles Davis and Jimi Hendrix? It seemed like a joke. Or at best, completely impossible timing. Brown typed a reply. Paul McCartney away from London on holiday, not expected to return for 2 weeks. Professional. Polite. Final. The telegram was sent back to Alan Douglas in New York. That was it. The session didn't happen that weekend. Maybe they'd try again later. Maybe they'd reschedule. But they never did. The moment passed. The window closed. And 11 months later, Jimi Hendrix was dead. What would it have sounded like? Miles was moving toward jazz fusion. Bitches Brew, released in 1970, would feature electric guitars, electric bass, multiple drummers, dense layers of improvisation. Dark. Funky. Hypnotic. Jimmy's playing was getting more experimental. Longer jams. More improvisation. Songs like Machine Gun from the Band of Gypsys album showed where he was heading. Extended explorations. Intense dynamics. Jazz-influenced phrasing. Paul McCartney's melodic, lyrical bass playing, precise, tuneful, structured, would have created an interesting tension with Miles's free-form approach and Jimmy's explosive spontaneity. Tony Williams's polyrhythmic drumming would have pushed everyone to their limits. At first, it sounds really weird and off the wall, Hendrix biographer Charles Sharmurray said. But on second thought, it makes perfect Hendrix-type sense to chuck in someone who's a great musician but comes from a different tradition. I regret this never actually took place. It would have been magnificent. Engineer Eddie Kramer, who produced most of Jimmy's music, agreed. I think it would have been phenomenal. Lord knows where it may have gone. Those huge egos in the studio at the same time. I would have loved to have done that one. But it was not to be. The plans continued into 1970. Miles and Jimmy were still talking. Still planning. Miles's autobiography mentions that he and legendary arranger Gil Evans, who'd worked with Miles on classics like Sketches of Spain, were in Europe planning to record with Jimmy at the time of Jimmy's death. They were going to meet in London in September 1970, after Jimmy played the Isle of Wight Festival. Miles was there too, performing on August 29th. Jimmy performed on August 30th. The plan was to get together after the festival, talk specifics, maybe even start recording. But it didn't happen. Logistics. Scheduling. The usual complications. On September 18th, 1970, Jimi Hendrix died in London. Asphyxiation from vomit after barbiturate overdose. Age 27. Miles got the call from Gil Evans in New York. What I didn't understand, Miles wrote in his autobiography, is why nobody told him not to mix alcohol and sleeping pills. The collaboration died with Jimmy. The album that could have been was never made. But the influence remained. After Jimmy's death, Miles kept searching for that Hendrix sound in his guitar players. Every guitarist he hired through the 1970s, Pete Cozy, Reggie Lucas, Dominique Gaumont, was expected to bring that Hendrix energy, that blend of rock power and jazz sophistication. Albums like Live Evil, On the Corner, Agartha, Pangea, all feature guitar work clearly influenced by what Jimmy was doing. Miles never stopped thinking about what could have been. In 1974, legendary arranger Gil Evans released an album. The Gil Evans Orchestra plays the music of Jimi Hendrix. A jazz tribute to Jimmy. The collaboration that never happened, reimagined. Miles's final years were haunted by unrealized dreams. The album with Jimmy was at the top of the list. That telegram, sent October 21st, 1969, still exists. It was purchased at auction in 1995 by Hard Rock Cafe for their memorabilia collection. Today it sits in a display case at the Hard Rock Cafe in Prague, Czech Republic. Stained, yellowed, typed on that old telegram paper with all the imperfections. You can read it if you go there. See the signatures: Jimi Hendrix, Miles Davis, Tony Williams. And you can see Peter Brown's reply: Paul McCartney away from London on holiday. A piece of paper that represents one of the greatest what-ifs in music history. Major Hendrix connoisseurs are aware of it, said hard rock historian Jeff Nolan. It would have been one of the most insane supergroups. These four cats certainly reinvented their instruments and the way they're perceived. French promoter and Hendrix fanatic Yazid Manu. It's amazing because of the names of the people. Of course that didn't happen, but the telegram brings us something to dream about. This is a document, proof that they had an idea to do an album. Paul McCartney is the only one of the four musicians still alive. Miles Davis died in 1991. Tony Williams died in 1997. Paul's spokesman said he's too busy to comb his memory for thoughts about a telegram sent more than 4 decades ago. But you have to wonder, does Paul ever think about it? That telegram he never saw? The session that never happened? What if he'd been in London that day? What if Peter Brown had called him in Scotland? What if Paul had jumped on a plane to New York? What would they have created? What would that first session have sounded like? Would it have been chaos, for massive egos unable to find common ground? Or would it have been transcendent, for geniuses speaking a musical language beyond genre, beyond category? We'll never know. October 21st, 1969. 3 musicians send a telegram to a 4th. We are recording an LP together this weekend. How about coming in to play bass? Simple, direct, history-making. But history didn't get made. The telegram arrived. The reply was sent. The session never happened. 11 months later, Jimmy was gone. And we're left with a piece of yellowed paper in a display case in Prague. A document of what could have been. Miles Davis, Jimi Hendrix, Paul McCartney, Tony Williams. For musicians who reinvented their instruments. For visions that almost converged. Jazz meets rock meets pop meets genius. The supergroup that never was. The album that music needed but never received. A reminder that sometimes the greatest art is the art that never got made.